You, of course, came in uh, well, much earlier during the Korea administration, but you were one of the longest serving,
Well, I
the
was one of three who served the full term of the
one of
president.
three. Okay, that was
But
you.
Jun Enriquez and Joe Almonte, who in the same position.
NSA.
No, sorry, Jun Enriquez was not even in the same position because he shifted to. It's really Ernie
Salvador.
Garilao, myself, Joe Almonte,
Ah.
who were consistently in the same position in his cabinet all 6 years.
So may achievement.
Yeah, that's something I'm proud of actually. That we.
You stayed the longest.
I like to think that as a reflection naman, as an affirmation
Oh,
of our usefulness in the cabinet.
Well, the president's trust and confidence. That you stayed there.
I'd like to put it that way. Well, I used to joke kasi he must have put somebody young because I was the youngest member of his cabinet at 39 when I was appointed. But I used to joke that the reason he probably did that is because he realizes that it's a good idea to put in charge of planning somebody who will still be young enough so that he will be able to suffer the consequences of bad planning later on.
Whatever it
I have a
was,
direct stake
Yeah.
in the future that I'm planning for. Diba? So, sabi nga, don't trust older men with planning because they won't suffer the consequences if they make a mistake. So that's the way I put it also, well, half jokingly.
But keep away from older men when they put you in planning positions also.
Frankly, I think I'm probably the youngest who was put in that position. And the current one, Ernie Pernia, is the oldest.
Oh, nga, no?
Because he was appointed at, more than 70?
70 plus.
Ernie?
Yes. Well, let me trace your roots back to the Cory period. You were already in public service then. Well, much earlier, you were teaching.
Well, I was
teaching
at
UP,
Los Baños,
yes.
and I chaired the economics department.
Yeah.
And
You got
really,
drafted.
I was practically arm twisted by my friend Don Padiranga to join him and help him at NEDA as Assistant Director General. And that was 1990. So I eventually relented. Actually, it took him weeks of courting me before he got me to agree to join government. But so I was there in NEDA, first as Assistant Director General, and then a year later as Deputy Director General, one of the three that Don had. And then when President Ramos was elected, he decided to ask me to take the leadership at NEDA.
Sorry. But before that, you did bump into FVR. I mean, he was
Defense
Chief of
Secretary.
Staff. SND na.
He was already SND at the time I was in government. So I would see him in the few times that I would have to represent Don Padiranga in the Cory cabinet meetings. So I would see him there up front, and of course I was somewhere near the back in the cabinet meeting. So that's about it. I mean, I don't remember having had any direct interaction with him.
Talaga? No first impressions?
Well, I couldn't have any because he was always at a distance. In fact, my first direct encounter with him was when he began to ask for briefings from the different agencies right after he was declared the winner. But even, of course, long before he even assumed office. But he started going around the departments. And NEDA happened to be one of the first, if possibly the first, that he went to get a briefing. And I guess the task fell on me because Don Padiranga happened to be out of the country. And I was the next in line.
Yeah.
So that was the first time I actually had a face-to-face and direct conversation with FVR.
Tell me what the first meeting was like.
Well, I went on with a straightforward briefing on the economy. And apparently, and it was many years later that I learned, he was impressed with that briefing. And that's among the factors that led him to decide to appoint me to the position. It was actually Angel Ramos who told me much later na nagustuhan kasi ni
that first briefing.
That briefing was impressed apparently. But anyway,
was he very was he makulit ba? Was he?
No, he's very perceptive because the thing about FVR is he knows his stuff, no, and I found him to be asking very perceptive questions and of course knowledgeable questions. In fact, just fast forwarding to his presidency, and I was there constantly being asked by PMS to be close by, to whisper in his ear in case something needed to be told him as a briefing. He always had the best answers. In fact, I was even struck. And I kept telling that to my colleagues in the cabinet. Bilib ako dyan sa boss natin. Maghahanda kang bumulong sa kanya. Hindi na kailangan. Mas maganda pa yung sagot niya. Kaysa doon sa what I could have whispered in his ear.
Yeah.
And that's really something that I was quite impressed with, because I could tell he does his homework.
That he does his
reads.
work.
And he knows what he's talking about. And whenever he opens his mouth, whether it's to the press, to other visiting dignitaries like the World Bank president or whoever, I almost never had to whisper in his ear, even though I was there ready to do that. Yeah.
Secretary, but that's a double-edged thing, right? I mean, the other side is, if you say something out of sync, then be prepared to get something from him. No?
And
you're not well prepared for this.
He's known for his legendary temper also. I mean, you could get a bawling out if you did the wrong things or said the wrong things, or essentially don't do your job well. No? So anyway, we were always prepared for that eventuality. But like I said, because I almost never had the chance to even give my prepared inputs, because he had all the answers in his mind already, even better than mine. So that kind of situation almost never arose.
When did you get the draft to become
Actually, it started when I got a call from Peter Garucho, who, as you know, started out as the executive secretary.
Yes, yeah.
But Peter was telling me that I was being considered, and he wanted me to meet Mondel Rosario. In other words, they wanted to check the chemistry among the core economic managers.
Yeah.
No?
Yeah.
So he set me up for a meeting. Peter was there with me and Mondel Rosario. And, again, we instantly clicked naman. And so not too long after that, then I got the word that I was going to be the next head of NEDA. And I never had any direct contact with FVR.
Talaga?
So all of that happened third person, through Peter Garucho primarily. And the only time I was face to face with FVR again was already for the oath-taking, the swearing in. So, that impressed me. First of all, quite unusually, I, along with several others in his cabinet, were relative unknowns. And so he was actually putting together a cabinet of, and contrary to past typical experience, not of luminaries already well known in the in the public arena. But I said, maybe he's just he was somehow impressed with perhaps my credentials, perhaps whatever his advisors had told him. But that's how I actually got drafted into his cabinet. It was almost indirect all throughout, so I could only surmise that people said the right things about me, and like I said, the only time I got face to face with him was in the swearing in already.
Well, or that first briefing. No?
That first briefing, after that first briefing.
That may have been the critical turning point.
It appears now that was the case. And as I said, it was years later that I learned from Angel how much of an impact that little briefing had on him.
How long was it anyway?
About an hour, just telling him about the latest state of the economy.
Yeah.
Similar to the things I do these days still. No, I mean it's something that I do routinely for companies, for groups. What's the latest performance and outlook for the economy? And an economist like me and many others of my similar profession are doing that really, called upon to give an economic briefing, so to speak. So exactly what I did. I had the standard numbers on GDP, inflation, unemployment, and then briefed them a little bit, I think, about NEDA itself and its role in the government. So that was about it.
That was it.
And I suppose the economic briefing itself was the one that stuck. And as I said, he was asking rather perceptive questions. And fortunately, I had the right answers also. So that may have been adding to his good impression.
You found out years later it was the job interview.
Yeah. I didn't realize that, to be honest. Yeah, at that time.
When did you take your oath?
That was
just a few months.
right after he took his oath in Luneta.
June 30.
We all went straight to Malacanang, and each of us took our oaths one by one.
And you headed off into the first cabinet
cabinet
of
meeting,
his
which was
presidency. How does that impress you of the man? I mean, he should have been having drinks, having a vin de Nord with.
We went straight to work. I mean, like I said, it was a long day because, of course, at noon, he took his oath of office in Luneta.
Right.
Then we are all herded into Malacanang. We all take our turns with our swearing in, and that was done individually, not as a group. And of course, we had our families with us, the usual photo op. So that took practically most of the afternoon. And then we all get into the state dining room for our first cabinet meeting. And that has always been a memorable meeting to me. And I've written about it several times in my own Inquirer column. Because I was struck at the message that he drove home quite clearly, and that was teamwork. Well, of course, he was later to summarize it in his favorite acronym UST, Unity, Solidarity, and Teamwork. But what I remember him telling us then was that if you have any differences in any policy or whatever question in governance, well, settle it among yourselves behind closed doors. Don't debate in public, because I think he was essentially saying that because, with all due respect to his predecessor, President Aquino, there was a lot of seemingly public debate among her cabinet members.
Policy was decided.
So he wanted he didn't want that kind of thing to happen. He wanted his administration to speak with one voice. So that was the teamwork that he was looking for. So he said, if you cannot, you will have to agree among yourselves behind closed doors. And if the consensus that arises from that kind of deliberation is something that you cannot live with, then it's either that you shut up or just ship out. So he was very firm in those words. In other words, he said, I want unity, solidarity, and teamwork in my cabinet. And that struck me ever since then, because that exactly is the mark of his leadership during his presidency. He really had his cabinet speaking in one voice. Of course, his famous doctrine of CSW, completed staff work, was essential in anything that he would sign.
That was such a task, wasn't it?
What? Sorry.
That was such a task, wasn't it?
Well, it meant that you had to make sure that all cabinet members, in other words, other agencies or departments of government involved in any decision or policy issuance that you are asking him to promulgate, must have already agreed. And again, the proper coordination should have already been done. So the most graphic evidence of that was his insistence that he sees signatures of the concerned cabinet members in the transmittal of a draft EO, a draft executive, a draft administrative order, or whatever issuance you expect him to sign. So that is the proof to him that coordination has been properly done.
And everybody's got to sign off.
Yep, that's essentially his requirement. Well, not a strict requirement, but he did say that is his preference.
There's got to be some consensus.
Malinaw that there's already a consensus, that there's already proper coordination and exchange of information that has been done.
What about the cases of, where there was not much, there was still disagreement? I mean, I understand, the teacher would ask you to stand in the corner. FVR, I understand, asks whoever the debating secretaries were to confine themselves to a room, And
there's this famous room. But again, first of all, if he does not feel convinced that something submitted to him for his action has not been properly deliberated, you would get back that piece of paper with big red letters CSW. So we all knew what we had to do. We had to go back to work and speak among ourselves and make sure that, again, that we can convince the president that the proper completed staff work had in fact been done. But if there are debates that persist, then he had this little room in Malacanang to the left of the stairs leading up to the state dining room, where it was only later that we heard him say something that struck us. It turned out he was always asking the staff to deliberately turn off the air conditioning in that room, so that it's as uncomfortable as possible,
Uh-huh.
and therefore everybody is in a hurry to get to a consensus. So that was always the room where people had to settle any differences. And yung pala yung kanyang tactic, no, na,
Crafty, huh?
and it was funny when we heard about that it was deliberate. But we were always wondering, "Man, init dito sa kwarto nito." But that really made us hurry to get to complete the meeting right away.
Akala nyo, tempers lang talaga.
But with hindsight, that was really amusing as well as really very enlightening as to perhaps the kinds of methods that he learned in the military. To be able to really elicit consensus very quickly.
Life in the FBR cabinet, I mean, at the start, we started meeting cabinet meetings in the palace, but eventually you were holding cabinet meetings,
That's
provincial
right.
cabinet meetings.
At
It was aside from CSW, I mean, it was also the logistical and physical strain of having to go out to the provinces. And why do you think that he imposed that?
Well, obviously, he wanted to make sure that we were all well grounded, exactly out there where the problems are. But apart from the cabinet meetings that went out of town, early on we could see that we had to do a lot of traveling, often with him, because he was just traveling all the time, going to different parts of the country and really hearing out people directly. And in that manner, I think bringing government and the top level of government close to the people, and that was sort of impressive but very taxing, especially for cabinet members like myself who had young children at the time, and so I would have to be traveling out of town. And frankly, there seemed to be this unwritten agreement between myself and the president that if we were to go out of town on a Sunday, I'm entitled to tag along members of my family, my children with me. So that's why I had some of my children being able to ride helicopters with me, because it was a Sunday and we were traveling with the president to go to somewhere, Pinatubo or Bataan and all that.
How did they take to that? I mean,
Well,
did they realize hey, this is the president?
Well, they were, I guess, too young and innocent to even realize that how big a privilege this was, not to be doing that. But again, as I said, I had to explain to the president, sir, I'm a young father and I have growing children, and I need at least one day of the week with them. And of course, that's because you can actually say really that my children were actually seeing me more on TV than in person.
Well, at least they knew where you were.
No, because I live in Los Baños all throughout my stay in fact up to now, I've always lived in Los Baños. When I was appointed to cabinet, I continued to live in Los Baños. So I would leave early in the morning when my children are still asleep. I come home at night when they are already asleep. That's why they would only really see me on weekends practically, and then see me on TV occasionally. But as I said, that's the reason why I ask the president if I may bring my children, bring my family, not necessarily all of them, whenever we had to go out with him on a Sunday. So, and he very graciously acceded to that little request. It came to the point that I even brought one of my daughters, still a young daughter at the time, to one of those sauna writing sessions in Malacanang.
Wow.
And he was very gracious about it. He even, played with my little daughter, gave her a souvenir flare pen, his trademark red flare pen, and a nice little souvenir note. But, my daughter was patiently waiting beside me, playing on the floor in the state dining room while we were there hours working on the State of the Nation address of the president. So it's that kind of thing that he was very tolerant of. Of course, he knew how it was, and his own daughters must have been young. So I was very pleased about that. But as I said, he had both a very hard work ethic that we had to keep up with, but then he had that human side of him that made him appreciate the importance of also maintaining my responsibility as a father.
So, to a certain extent, he was a taskmaster, but good boss, bad boss. Was there a good cop, bad cop role that someone in the cabinet had to play or had to push in lieu of FBR? balling out.
Well, no, but
Like-
because all of us, I think every single one of us, experienced the balling out.
Had their opportunity. Ano?
Yeah, a certain opportunity. I'd like to think, and I'm proud of the fact that I probably am one who had experienced it the least. In fact, I could only remember one incident
Talaga?
when I received a bawling out individually. There was one time we did receive a bawling out as a group, but it's funny because it's something that almost became a trademark. That if you didn't experience it, there must be something wrong with you. So anyway, it's something that later on people were
Became
beginning
a
to
badge.
take. Well, it's a badge. Also, we learn to take it in stride, but take it seriously, obviously. Because the thing about the boss is that even after you receive a bawling out, like within half an hour later, you're okay. I mean, you know, he's very pleasant with you again. So it's not something that you feel sticks, no. So we believe that was that kind of leadership that really
I'm
helped
reading-
keep us on our toes, bring out the best in us. And mind you, that's my definition of a good leader, and that's what I see in him. He brings out the best in the
In his
people that
people.
he leads.
Yeah, yeah.
And to me, that's the mark of a good leader.
I'm reading very professional management style. Is it right? Is that
Exactly, and then I'm sure it's his years in the military that really honed him into the kind of leader that he had been.
But he didn't exactly plan for it, ano? I mean, he was just really
Well, yeah, he was very natural about everything.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, of course, the other thing that impressed most of us, and I'm sure you may hear this from other cabinet members, is he seemed to have a knack for multitasking. You know, in presiding cabinet meetings, you think he's not listening, because he's getting distracted by different aides or even cabinet members sitting beside him in side conversations while somebody is making a presentation. And then as soon as that presentation is done, he will ask very sensible questions as if he had been listening all along. Of course, we realized that he had actually read read the presentation
material
even
already,
before. So he's prepared. But again, it's funny because he was really attending to several things at the same time, usually while presiding a cabinet meeting, and yet was still very effectively presiding over the cabinet meeting and participating substantively in it.
Yeah,
Impressed na impressed kami sa kanya talaga on that matter.
multi-track, ano?
No, talagang ano siya. But again, we can only attribute it to his military background, that he must have acquired the skill to do that kind of thing.
Yeah. I suppose immediate was power. No?
Well, it was a challenge that he started out as a plurality president. Remember,
Okay.
he won in a field of 5 candidates, I think. And the funny thing, and he himself was joking about it, was that like 2 weeks after he was president, 60% of the people were claiming that 60% of people he encountered were claiming that they voted
They
for
voted
him.
for him.
But then again, I think that the way that he really reached out to every party, and again, that's one of the hallmarks of his leadership. He didn't draw lines with people who appeared to be political opposition or political opponents. He had an inclusive kind of leadership,
Engaged,
and therefore unifying leadership. And that's very important because he really reached out to everybody. And then, of course, he had this Rainbow Coalition
Yes.
that resulted from precisely this very deliberate effort to make sure that all the different political parties and different political groups eventually united and to rally under his own vision for the Philippines, the so-called Philippines 2000 at the time.
Yeah.
Quickly found a lot of support.
Explain that to me. How did he explain that to you guys? I mean, to you. I mean, you were.
I must
you were
admit
both
that
NEDA and Socio-Eco. So
I must admit that there was an initial pushback at NEDA because the Philippines 2000 idea didn't come from us. It actually, at least the catchword itself, came from the group of Joe Almonte and the likes of Apinta Lisayon. They were the think tank that came up with this battle cry of Philippines 2000.
Yep.
So what I tried to do was reconcile that, in fact, with the medium-term Philippine Development Plan,
Yeah, there you
which NEDA at the time was in the middle of crafting, and said there's no incompatibility between the kind of vision that Joe Al and his people were painting and what the medium-term plan, which is really a much more technically formulated document. Was saying. So it was easy to reconcile that. And frankly, I had to convince my people at NEDA that we can treat these as one and the same thing. But again, one of the things I did early on after getting appointed was to seek a one-on-one meeting with Joe Almonte.
Okay.
Because I could tell from the very beginning that he was going to be influential, especially in the thought processes of the president, and therefore he was going to be potentially a strong ally in pushing for the right development directions. And of course, would be embodied in the development plan. So I invited Joe out to lunch. We had a good lunch at Manila Hotel, and we discovered very quickly that we shared a lot of our ideals for the country. And so from then on, we actually had a good working cooperative relationship with Joe Al at the National Security Council. In fact, there were certain instances where I had to ask his assistance in some special types of operations to get certain policy agenda more widely accepted and to fend off certain opposition. But in short, we shared a lot of the ideas that, of course, FVR himself had provided as his vision at the very beginning. You will recall his vision or his strategy for the country at the time was the twin goals of people empowerment and global competitiveness, international competitiveness. So these were essentially the battle cry of the Philippine Development Plan and of Philippines 2000 as a result. So that was the marriage, in effect, of the visioning and technical work that Joe Almonte and his group at the National Security Council had done, and the technical people, the experts at NEDA, had also put together in the draft development plan.
Yun yung think tank, ano? Yung
meron
MSA,
siyang small group that included the likes of Apin Talisayon, Tony Abad, several others.
who did nothing but,
And they were strategic about the future of the country, and they were thinking long term. And that's the difference. And because, as some people may remember, he was faulted for actually drawing a vision for a year beyond his term, as if he was planning to stay beyond 1998. Because he was being accused left and right then that why is he saying 2000 when his term only goes until 1998? But then again, it was of course a very catchy battle cry.
Yes.
It was inspired, I think, by Japan Inc., which was the catchphrase for Japan at that time. So our version of Japan Inc. is Philippines 2000.
And then you had UST, you had
CSW,
CSW, CSD, caring, sharing.
Caring, sharing.
Daring.
Caring and sharing, and then daring. Was
So
the third one.
Quite a number of sectors, on the economic side. Trade, liberalization, ease of doing business, addressing the infrastructure gap. I mean, opening up or breaking up the cartels, the monopolies. I mean,
that was very key, in fact.
That was one big headache for you, wasn't it?
Well, as I said, it helped that we had Joe Al also pushing exactly the same agenda, and they have their own special ways of doing things that got things done. I mean, the kind of back channel work, or even sometimes special operations types of things that got these things through. I mean, for example, the breaking of monopolies and cartels. Telecommunications was one of the first things that the Ramos administration essentially opened up, and that's why we ended up with up to 9 telephone companies, and that was a very deliberate move, because we had seen that at that time you couldn't really consider telephone communications as a natural monopoly anymore, which is, as defined in our economics textbook, it has to be a monopoly because the market is too small to support more than one. But that time we had all come to the realization that the market was big enough to support more players. And so one of the first things that FVR did was to open up the telecommunication sector. And of course we wouldn't have the kind of telecommunication services we have now if not for that increased competition that came in with the entry of FVR and his administration into the picture. And this is very critical, I think, no, to how he really changed the nature of the economy at that time. Then, of course, trade liberalization, opening up the economy to greater competition, was the other one. In fact, at one point, we were
Retail trade, banking.
essentially opening up to
Diba?
competition. I mean,
Shipping.
the same principle of more competition is good for, especially for consumers who now get a wider choice of goods and services, and of course lower prices for those same goods and services. So that was the principle behind breaking up cartels and monopolies, opening up trade and investment, and then all retail trade liberalization and so on. And of course, even liberalizing on foreign exchange transactions.
Yes.
Because again, it had been a tightly controlled market, whether in terms of capital or current accounts in foreign exchange flows. And again, President Ramos actually led the opening up of that as well. And therefore, we had a much more market-oriented exchange rate determination.
And then at the same time, it also impacted on the social component, right? I mean, it empowered people. I mean, gave them the power of choice.
Precisely, yeah. And of course, at the same time, he had a very deliberate social reform agenda that by 1995 was already a central program of the government. Now, the social reform agenda, which was placed under our colleague, Secretary Ernie Garilao of DAR at the time, eventually turned into the National Anti-Poverty Council, which was really the institutionalization of the Social Reform Council, which was the interagency body that pushed the social reform agenda. So that was the social part of the economic development thrust that Ramos had pushed. So, it really made for a truly holistic and balanced approach to our development. And a third element I must mention is the environmental part of it, the sustainable development part. Because early in his term, he promulgated an executive order that formed the Philippine Council for Sustainable Development, PCSD. That was Executive Order number 15. Because right after he came into office, the Rio Earth Summit happened, and our NGO community was there very actively. And when they came back, they prevailed upon the president to create this council, and he readily agreed to do that. And then he put me in the middle. He put me as chair with the recognition that if you put the environment secretary, it will again just sectoralize this council. But you needed the planning, the oversight agency, NEDA, on top of it, so that it's mainstreamed into everything. So again, that's very important because Agenda 21, the Earth Summit, recognized that sustainable development has three dimensions. That's a social, which he took care of with the social reform agenda. The economic, of course, embodied mostly in the Philippine Development Plan, and then the environmental, which was the PCSD's work. So, kompleto. I mean, he had a very holistic approach to plotting our nation's future.
Noong una pa lang ba nandun na? I mean, when he got into office, nakita mo na yun? Did you see that?
Not immediately.
Was it already something that, was pretty clear to him?
Well, at least not evidently immediately, but very quickly we were seeing exactly what kind of thinking he was bringing into his presidency. I forgot how early it was when he started defining his 5 Ds of development, because again, that was the other way that he would describe his overall development program for the country. The 5 Ds in devolution, decentralization, deregulation, democratization, and then development that is sustainable, or sustainable development. So those, in fact, throughout my 6 years as head of NEDA, I was constantly explaining that to the public, the 5 Ds. Because this is exactly the holistic depiction of the way he's actually leading the country to a sustainable development.
You mentioned it a bit earlier. Can you recall a few of the challenges posed by interest, lobby groups, the cartels?
Well,
what was it like? Was it dirty? I mean,
well, I didn't see then the kind of dirty tactics that I saw subsequently after his presidency. But then again, there were challenges of this kind. No? One particularly memorable episode that lasted for months was, the debate about petrochemical tariffs, for example. And there was, in fact, there was a division in the cabinet on the matter of the tariffs that must be imposed on petrochemical products. Because on one hand, there was a position that we needed to protect petrochemicals so that our own petrochemical industry can supposedly develop, and then we can then have stronger industrialization.
Yeah.
The other school of thought, to which I belong, was that, well, no, it will be inconsistent with our opening up our economy if we gave a special protective shield to one particular sector, which
Right.
was petrochemicals.
Right.
And so, in short, there was, this was a battle that went on for months, to the point that we had to divide the group in the Tariff and Related Matters Committee of the NEDA board to be able to reach a decision. And happily, the more open position prevailed at that time. But it was a contentious debate, which involved, in fact, obtaining information about the real state of that industry at the time.
Correct.
And this is where the friendship with Joe Almonte came in, by the way.
But it was regulated, ano? The petroleum industry at that time was regulated. There were
Well, petroleum, yeah.
only three,
But I'm talking about petrochemicals, which is the raw material for plastic.
Right.
And so the reason it became very contentious is because there's so many things downstream that are dependent.
Yes.
So if petrochemicals, which are derived again from petroleum, in
Yes.
fact, practically a side product of petroleum refining. But when these are made more expensive by higher tariffs because you want to protect a domestic petrochemical producer, then everything else down the line becomes more expensive, including, so we were pointing out that even farmers' sacks for rice,
Right.
which were more plastic already, hindi na yung
Yes.
jute nor
Yes.
abaka. Irrigation hoses, everythh else, were going to be affected if petrochemicals and therefore plastics will be more expensive. In short, that was the kind of reasoning that we had, and this is where, as I said, I brought into play the alliance with Joe Almonte and sought their help in building a constituency behind that position of, not providing that special protection to a particular sector.
What about the introduction of our VAT ba yun?
Yes, that was a challenge. When
That
the VAT that was introduced by President Cory
Right.
in 1988 had to be further expanded in coverage during the
RVAT.
term of President Ramos, the RVAT, I found myself at the receiving end of curses and all sorts of brickbats, especially in one TV show, a Magandang Gabi Bayan episode, where I was the lone government official, essentially defending it against a panel of hostile critics, including some senators at the time. But again, that was a very challenging episode at the time, because we knew we needed to do this because there was a lot of distortion in the way the VAT was being implemented, precisely because of the presence of so many exemptions. Because that our VAT really was to try and minimize those exemptions.
Rationalize.
And obviously, by doing that, there will be sectors that will be hurt who are enjoying these exemptions before.
Yeah.
So that was one of the advocacy challenges I had as an economic policymaker.
Lobby, that was a very strong lobby.
There was certainly a strong resistance. Whether there was an organized lobby was hard for me to tell, but clearly we had strong opposition at the time. But the president and his cabinet, and of course the Rainbow Coalition in Congress, did finally get the necessary tax reforms through, which was actually summarized in the CTRP, the Comprehensive Tax Reform Program, that came about in the latter part of the Ramos administration.
Another thing, Secretary, was nearly every week, at least one day was devoted to opening all these light industrial parks, eco zones, factories all over. I mean, the penchant for that, no? I mean, was that really also opening us up
Well, first of all, there was a lot of interest in the Philippines from foreign investors. Before I even talk about those industrial parks, the road shows that we had to promote the Philippines as an investment destination
Overseas,
was quite striking because well, we would go to places in Europe, or in North America, in the United States, where we would be told by our hosts that in the past they had to put these kinds of meetings in the smallest room they can find because they didn't want to be embarrassed of not being able to fill the room with enough people interested to invest in the Philippines. During the time of President Ramos, we were being told that they already had to rent the largest rooms to do these investment presentations by us, the economic managers, and they still were running out of space. So that was a very graphic illustration of the great interest of investors in the country. And so that translated precisely into a strong demand for locations in different economic zones. And of course, part of the Ramos program was to establish a special economic zone well, we called it agri-industrial zones in every region of the country, in all of the 16 regions.
To complement the...
So that's really where to locate the investors who were interested in, again, contributing to creating jobs in the country. So it was an era where the investment interest in the Philippines was very high. And foreign direct investments, in fact, were coming in. Nothing like what it was the years before. So in other words, we had suddenly we were in the limelight. Suddenly we were in the map of the world as far as foreign investments were concerned.
And we've actually, that administration actually set the bar for succeeding administrations.
I'd like to think so, indeed, because really, with that high investment interest, it was incumbent on the successors of President Ramos to do the same kind of salesmanship that he actually did. He was people describe him as the best salesman for the country in terms of attracting investments and attracting trade opportunities.
He fancied himself as the Philippines' #1 salesman, right?
Indeed, and he played the part very well.
Yeah, pretty well. Yeah, right. What was the turning point, Secretary? Was it? I remember an article at time when he came in, turned on the lights, and the economy lighted up. I mean, that's something like that. Was that the turning point?
Well,
that he was able to show that his administration had, the political will and the,
Well, that was really a very graphic demonstration precisely of his political will. We all came into the government, and he took over the leadership of the government at the time that we were suffering very regular brownouts because of lack of power capacity. And seeing that, of course, working with Congress, they gave him some emergency powers at some point so that he was able to come up with stopgap solutions right away. Of course, those stopgap solutions that he put together through his emergency powers were mainly those short-lived diesel power plants. But at the same time, that's when we practically invented the BOT, or what's now known as the PPP projects, or the public-private partnerships. Of course, we apparently were the first country in the world to come up with legislation to provide a policy framework for build, operate, transfer, and similar schemes. And essentially we were guinea pigs, but we became the model for other countries that quickly followed suit in essentially inviting the private sector to build the infrastructure, including, in this case, power plants. So the power problem was quickly overcome, and that's why, again, he was described as the man who turned on the lights.
Right.
Because we were really, literally in darkness many hours of the day before that kind of intervention came in. Of course, he was later to be faulted for over-providing for power, and then was pilloried along with his his economic managers, and especially his Napocor president at the time, for supposedly over-providing. And anyway, in short, we would always reason out that it is even more costly not to have any power, and or not to have enough power
than to have
an oversupply. I mean, of course, that's with hindsight. That obviously, it's you had to make a judgment call, and he did. And it was his political will that got us out of the problem. I think more quickly than other countries probably would have.
Something you mentioned also earlier was him putting together the cabinet clusters, I mean specific focused groups or clusters within the cabinet to address the issues. I mean,
Well, that was something he actually inherited.
management tool, ano?
He actually inherited that from President Cory Aquino. Even under President Cory, there were already these clusters A, B, C, D, and E
Right, right.
in the cabinet. Well, I don't recall too well anymore which is which, but I remember that cluster B was the macroeconomic management, and then there was a cluster C on, if I remember correctly, the social development concerns or human development concerns. So again, there were logical groupings, another cluster for peace and security issues, and so on. With of course, the appropriate cabinet agencies and cabinet members being members of that. So apart from the regular cabinet meetings, which was always religiously done every week throughout his presidency,
Yep.
there were also cabinet cluster meetings
Yep.
done in between. Because again, this was the mechanism to make sure that whatever specific policy pronouncements or instruments were going to be done was going to be well vetted, and again, the completed staff work was already done before it's presented to the entire cabinet.
Well, his way of seeing to it that everybody's on the right track. ano?
Again, the teamwork that he was preaching happened through that mechanism. And then, of course, full cabinet meetings very regularly. And, that really made a great difference, because when the whole cabinet does get together regularly, then at least everybody knows what the others are doing.
Yeah. Yung distressed sectors, he was also particularly focused on that, no? Women, children, senior citizens,
Yeah.
PWDs, health insurance coverage. Ito yung di ba? Ito yung mga unang bugso di ba, at that time.
Well, I think the reason he put together the social reform agenda and therefore the social reform council that in effect operationalized the social reform agenda was precisely that recognition that we have to look at the marginalized sectors, the women, the children, the disabled, farmers, and so on. No? And that's really, as I said, that has become the building blocks for the National Anti-Poverty Commission, which is precisely composed of those basic sectors, as they call them, from the different marginalized sectors of the economy. And he had a very keen concern about poverty and how it was persistent in the Philippines. And by the way, he actually knew exactly where the poorest Filipinos are. I remember in more than one occasion when I would report to the president the latest poverty statistics, actually to the cabinet as a whole. I remember one particular cabinet meeting where I was reporting that the highest poverty incidence was in, I think it was in Region 5, the Bicol region. And then he started questioning that. He said, no, I have seen Bicol, I have seen Zamboanga, and I think it's worse there. In other words, talagang he had a keen sense of where the poverty is and how bad the poverty is exactly. So I think he was very cognizant of that throughout his administration, and that's why the SRA, the Social Reform Agenda, became a prominent part of his push for a more equitable and social development.
Coupled alongside the domestic initiatives, he was also very active in establishing the Philippines as a member of the global community.
Oh, yeah.
ASEAN, APEC,
Right.
and then the first meetings of Asia, Europe, di ba? ASEM?
Yeah,
Di ba?
ASEM.
That one. So, ano rin, he liked working along parallel tracks din, and leveraged on those associations.
That's
di
right.
ba?
Yeah. No, first of all, he had a very different view of foreign policy, perhaps, than his predecessors. One of the first things that he did in giving guidance to our foreign missions abroad was that it's no longer just political diplomacy; it's economic diplomacy that's more important in your work, he said. And in a sense, that was the basis for his instruction through the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, that there will really be a team effort in every mission abroad, whether it's an embassy or a consulate, so that all the attachés, and some of these attachés, are answering to a different department, right? Not necessarily the Department of Foreign Affairs,
Yes,
but they were all guided to work as a team, and of course with the ambassador at the head of it. But again, the striking part of it, he said, it's not about political diplomacy; it's economic diplomacy, including, by the way, economic intelligence. If you have to collect some data
Right.
directly or indirectly to help our own businesses reach foreign markets, then we should be able to do that with the hilt. And so again, the economic diplomacy thrust was something that he pursued through that kind of guidance to our foreign missions, and precisely by capitalizing on our relationships through various trade groupings and trade agreements. And ASEAN, of course, was most prominent for this region. But of course, he bought in very strongly in the APEC, and we hosted the APEC during his term in 1996. So that was a big deal for all of us. And he saw the value in these different kinds of economic partnerships that we had with our neighbors, and even with distant partners like Europe, for example. So again, the Asia-Europe partnership was something that he also strongly believed in.
Pero hindi ba pati sa security, ginamit niya yung foreign policy or yung foreign affairs, the management of our foreign affairs to leverage on our security?
Oh, yeah.
And I'm referring to the South China Sea.
That's right. Yeah.
Midstream in his administration, di ba, we were getting to see more incursions. They were fishing vessels and they were just, seeking shelter. And,
Well, the thing that struck many of us in his administration was he had a very skillful brinkmanship in dealing with China and Taiwan, which has been and always has been a close friend as well. And I don't know whether it's something that can be told now. You can edit this out if necessary, but
Please go ahead.
But there was one time that the Taiwanese president flew in clandestinely into Clark, and several of us cabinet members were asked to join the president in this evening meeting in this house in Clark with the Taiwanese president who flew in. And apparently just flew in for a few hours and then flew out again. But he was keeping this kind of balanced diplomacy with Taiwan and then the mainland China. But that was the way he was actually dealing with our relations, almost to the point of brinkmanship in all of these relations. And China, of course, he was also leveraging the rest of ASEAN in dealing with China, because obviously you can only deal with China effectively as a group rather than a small guy trying to deal directly with the large guy. So I think he was very skillful in that, and in a sense he may have gotten that from his father, who was obviously a diplomat himself. He was proud of the fact that his father was one of the original founding fathers of the ASEAN, and in fact a signatory to the ASEAN agreement that originally got it moving. So again, his diplomatic skills were really put to bear on all of these relationships we had that included conflicts in the area.
So, I remember that incident. It was reported about a day or so later.
That's right.
And,
so in effect,
Beijing cried foul.
I know. But the president had a very skillful way of dealing with Beijing whenever they were complaining about these overtures that they were having at the same time with Taiwan.
Yeah, well,
I think the
Taiwan
president and his
China.
father had a special relationship with Taiwan too. That's why he was not about to forsake that.
Yes. Plus also the investments from both China and Taiwan were just about equal.
Well,
I mean,
they were valuable.
They were really very, Tell me about the emergency operation of 96.
The what emergency operation?
Emergency. Yeah, his operation that he had to.
Well,
were you?
I was one of those who didn't know very much about it. Of course, we all learned about the carotid operation and all that, but it was hardly felt by us because it happened very quickly, and he was out. He recovered very quickly. But of course, inevitably, there was a buzz among us when we heard about this, unexpected medical procedure that the president had to go
Were you
through.
worried?
Frankly, I don't recall feeling worried at that time because I had some confidence that this guy, patumbakal ito. So, I had every confidence that he was just going to bounce back.
And the information coming out was pretty fairly well managed.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, if not well managed, it could have been something that would have worried us. But I don't think, as I said, I don't recall feeling worried at the time because it was also a relatively quick episode.
Yeah, yeah. But the stock market did dip a few points that day, but recovered the next day. You weren't worried to work for...
Sorry?
You weren't worried to work for Joseph Estrada?
Not really. But at least, from my personal point of view, I had a good relationship with the vice president, and we happened to have almost the same birthdays. His birthday is April 19. I'm April 20.
Oh,
so every time we would celebrate our birthdays in a cabinet meeting, both of us would get a birthday cake. So kakantahan kami ng happy birthday, both Vice President Erap and myself. But anyway, as I said, I on a personal level, I had a good relationship with the vice president.
So the reforms were going on at a fast clip, pretty good pace. We went out from really dark to lighted economy, and we were no longer the sick man of Asia. And some business publications were calling us the newest Tiger Cub, Tiger economy.
Asian Tiger, Tiger Cub.
Rising. But was there a noticeable concern heading towards the 5th and 6th year about how that momentum could be sustained?
Well, I recall that there was a time when people were beginning to worry about overheating because the economy precisely was accelerating its growth year after year. But still the Asian financial crisis when it came, and that was still within the term of the president,
that clipped it.
Was actually a surprise practically to everybody at the time. But anyway, that kind of apprehension sort of disappeared because, number one, we actually showed a resilience to that Asian financial crisis. And most of us half-jokingly would say, well, because we already had practice. We had our own internal financial crisis during the assassination of President Aquino, during the assassination of Senator Aquino in the early 80s, and which led, of course, to a lot of capital flight and all that. And so that led our central bank to put in place the right prudential regulations to make sure that our financial institutions are not caught off guard. And that's the reason, to a large extent, why we were saying that we had a resilience that got us through the Asian financial crisis relatively unscathed compared to our neighbors.
Pretty well cautioned against that trouble.
Well, our financial sector particularly was somewhat stronger.
Incidentally, we had a new central bank, right?
Yeah, early, in fact, in the Ramos administration, the Bangko Sentral law was passed and reorganized it. In fact, I lost my monetary board seat because of that, because it reversed the ratio from 5 government to 2 private sector members in the monetary board to the other way around, 5 private and 2 government. And so anyway, the reorganized Bangko Sentral, which also cleaned up its books and again made it financially stronger, also helped strengthen the monetary authority in fending off the pressures that came from the Asian financial crisis.
Which leads me to recall our reserves were also on
they
the
were
uptick,
they were growing. They were constantly on the rise. In fact, at that time, frankly, we were content with having at least 3 months worth of imports in our foreign reserves, and we were able to maintain that and grow, in fact, somewhat beyond that 3 months worth of level of imports. Nowadays, by the way, we have like 9 months of imports, so it's a far cry from even then. But as I said, the financial standing of the Bangko Sentral was improved dramatically because of the reorganization. And secondly, the management of the Bangko Sentral also became much more focused, especially later and on to beyond President Ramos's term, more focused on inflation management rather than exchange rate management.
Yes, yes. How did you take to the People's Initiative, Pirma, constituent? I mean, they said 6 months was too short for a good man.
6 years, yeah.
I'm sorry, 6 years was too short for a good man, and 6 years was too long for a poor performer. So, how did you, the cabinet, take to that proposition? I mean, Pirma, Constituent Assembly, People's Initiative.
Well, our role, NEDA's role in that whole question was to fulfill an instruction from the President, which was to use the regional development councils to get the pulse of the people on this initiative. So we did our job earnestly on that. I directed the NEDA regional directors, who are almost ex officio, but as a rule, they are the vice chairs of the regional development councils, because the NEDA regional officers provide the secretariat support.
Yes.
So the RDCs were mobilized to essentially get the pulse in the regions on the Pirma initiative. And what happened was that we were overwhelmingly getting the feedback that there was strong opposition to
Resistance.
it. So the guidance I gave our regional directors at NEDA was tell it like it is. And so when we collated all the reports and they were all somewhat adverse, I reported it as is. I drafted a memo to the President to tell him this is what we're finding. And we submitted that to the President directly. And I'd like to think that that must have been instrumental in his own voluntary withdrawal of that initiative. In fact, to the disappointment of many people around him.
Many, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And in fact, I remember how when he announced the dropping of the Pirma or the initiative for a Chacha, if I remember correctly, it was when he had just arrived from a foreign trip where he landed in Davao. And upon landing, he makes that announcement.
APEC.
That was something that happened right after I had submitted to him, while he was still on that foreign trip, this memo. That this is the pulse of the people. That they are not in favor of it.
That was 97.
And so I'm not even sure, but I started feeling some negative vibes from some of my cabinet members who didn't like the fact that we were telling the President that it's not a popular move. But we had to tell it to him like it is.
But the pulse from the business community also was not too warm, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, that was really a time when any attempt to amend the Constitution was always seen with great suspicion that the primary motivation is really to extend one's power, or again to remove the term limits and all that. At that time, of course, we, the economic managers, had something more important in mind, which is, again, the persistent clamor for us to open up our economy because of the restrictions in the 1987 Constitution. In any case, because of that seemed to be the general presumption that the President wanted to perpetuate himself in power. Plus the fact that former President Cory Aquino actively and vigorously campaigned against it, may have also affected public sentiment. And then, as I said, the President seemed to genuinely want to know exactly how the people feel, and we told him the way it was, at least based on the RDC's consultations. Then, that may have been instrumental in his backing down himself.
I missed out two acronyms which I wanted you to react on. LEDAC and PLLO.
Okay. What's the second one?
PLLO, the Presidential Legislative Liaison Office. I mean, those two were management tools for him,
And very, very effective management tools, I must say. LEDAC, the Legislative Executive Development Advisory Council, was actually a brainchild of NEDA. Early on in his term, I and my deputy then, Chito Sobrepeña, had drafted the bill that would create Legislative Executive Development Advisory Council, or LEDAC. And, well, happily, the Congress quickly passed it.
Yes.
So this mechanism for closer coordination between the executive and the legislature was created. The striking thing is that the law only provided for a quarterly meeting of this council. The president did much better than that. He convened the LEDAC every week.
Oh, well,
Every time that the Congress was in session, we had a weekly meeting early in the morning of Wednesday.
Yes.
And actually, the burden fell on me in many ways because we were the secretariat of the LEDAC, NEDA. And therefore, before every LEDAC meeting, early in the morning on Wednesdays, I would have to meet with the Senate President and Senate Majority Leader and the House Speaker and the House Majority Leader over at this room in Manila Hotel to coordinate the agenda for the following day's meeting. So anyway, he used this mechanism very, very effectively to push through a lot of very significant legislation. And I think that's one of the legacies that he continues to be proud of, that during his presidency there were hundreds of significant laws of economic, social, political reform.
But that was
that
really
were passed.
also very FVR, no? He was a
Again,
consensus
he's
builder.
he's a bridge builder. No,
Okay.
Where there are gaps, he would bridge those gaps.
Engineer. No?
And unify. That's why I like to describe it as unifying leadership, which is the kind of leadership we really need in this country. And unfortunately, that's not what we're seeing nowadays, especially when you can't have leaders who are actually even deepening the gaps or accentuating the differences in our society and in our politics.
Driving
But he
the
was the one
wedge.
who reached out to everybody, and he was blind to political affiliation. He was blind to well, I like to describe him as he was color blind. There were no yellows, no reds, no blues.
Yeah.
It's everybody got their share of the era. Everybody got their share of the at that time I think it was still called CDF, the pork barrel, the Countrywide Development Fund, whether or not you're the opposition or an administration ally. And of course that has changed dramatically since that time. Because later these things, the era and the pork barrel, are being used as a political tool by our national leadership. He did not. So everybody got their rightful share of these resources, regardless of political affiliation. That's why I see him as a leader who was truly unifying. Wala yung ganung political divisions sa kanya.
At least one of your colleagues in the cabinet took the route of politics. Juan Flavier.
Oh yeah,
Very
reluctantly.
Reluctantly, but
he
he
did
was
well.
very successful. No? Did that option ever occur to you?
Well, I never had any inclination towards politics in the sense of elective politics. But well, the more well-known and popular in his cabinet inevitably had to succumb to that kind of pressure, whether or not they liked it. In my case, I was trying to do my work quietly and inconspicuously as much as I could, and that's why to this date I think I'm probably one of the least recognized among his cabinet members, and even then. No? But that's why wala talaga sa aking desires at the time to run for political office.
Tinanong ko kasi, well, the option kasi to go the political route in order to continue the reforms.
That's right.
A few have actually mentioned that. Public servant, you were, UP professor. And then NEDA, and then the entire 6-year stretch. How did FVR's brand of leadership, work ethic influence you, your team?
Well, clearly, again, he led by example, and I think all of us in his cabinet imbibed that kind of leadership. I learned many lessons of leadership just watching him exercise his own leadership. And as I said, I came to the conclusion that the most important attributes of good leadership is, number one, this unifying nature of leadership, but not drawing the lines, but in fact bridging the gaps among those that he led. Secondly, of course, the importance of unity and solidarity and teamwork, and therefore the need for open communication lines among those that you lead. And that's why in my own little domain at NEDA, I had preached a seamless NEDA, or seamlessness was my doctrine that I left at NEDA, that there was be no dividing lines across the different units or staffs, as we call them in NEDA, because one of the biggest problems we see to this date in government is what we call silo mentality.
Yeah.
And you see that even within the same department, that one silo under one undersecretary hardly ever talks to the other silo under a different undersecretary, which is something that I tried very deliberately to erase these silos and these demarcation lines. And again, I got that from seeing how FVR worked. That he made sure that there was always open communication lines among everybody. I mean, the doctrine of CSW, in fact, was the guiding principle behind all of that. And the other thing I like to say about his leadership was he had this tendency to create an interagency body to tackle various issues, from something specific as how to make use of the big areas of land in the Iwahig Penal Colony, because he happened to put me as chair of that, to bigger things like, more of macroeconomic policy making and all that. But the thing is, he used this mechanism of interagency bodies and mechanisms to ensure precisely that teamwork happens and there's a unified response to various issues confronting the government. So again, that's something that I imbibe myself, that you really have to get people to talk together to be able to get things done properly and effectively.
Were you asked to continue on after FVR? Hindi na?
No.
Oh,
No, in
so
fact,
nagretiro ka na.
unbeknownst to many, I think, I actually, at one point, vied, when the Lakas party was undergoing its selection process for who would succeed President Ramos, I actually jumped into the fray. But of course, that's a whole story in itself that I'd rather not get into. But it was a very spiritual calling at the time. And my wife is very much part of that story as well. I could write a whole book about it because it was a very, very profound experience.
Okay.
But long story short, I actually was one of the 7 or 8 people who actually vied for the nomination of Lakas. And President Ramos actually was silently egging me on at the time. But when ultimately, as we all know, he chose the Venetia to be the anointed one. And,
Talaga, for president?
Yeah.
You
well,
considered
I was
mali pala yung
perhaps,
tanong ko, no? Hindi pala Senate. Dapat pala.
but only because I and my wife and I were convinced that we were getting this leading. And I'm not ashamed to say, we believe that there was this calling coming from above to vie for that, and so we did. And in fact, I had to explain to the president every step of the way what was the motivation for this, and he took that very seriously. Unlike some of my fellow cabinet members who took me to be out of my mind because I was hearing voices from heaven and all that. But precisely that was maybe that's a fair way to describe exactly what led me to do that. And actually go for that. So we went through the process. I went through the process of essentially competing for the nomination of the Lakas party.
Yeah.
But when that did not happen, and of course in the end, to be honest, I was even relieved after that episode because I felt such a heavy burden when I was feeling pushed to do this. I asked the president, should I continue heading NEDA after that episode? And I said, by all means, you have to sustain your work. But then again, the whole understanding was after his term, we're all coterminous, so except for 1 or 2 of us who were retained by President Estrada, we all exited from government. And that's the last time I was in government, and never really sought to be back in government again after that.
What are the interactions between you and FBR these days? I mean, post-98. What are the discussions like?
Well, it's always interesting because it's fun to talk with him because he has, his own views on how things are happening. And well, of course, most of the time we are talking about something I wrote about him in my column. I would often get a note from him written on the margin of a photocopy of my column. Because again, I out of sheer admiration for him, I find myself once in a while writing about his leadership style and how I'm looking for it in our current leaders and all that. So, and then we would wax nostalgic and talk about the times that he precisely was exhibiting this kind of leadership and experiences with Myanmar, for example, and how we became the first, or how we became a donor country to Myanmar during his presidency. Because on this, just a sidelight on this, because when I made an official visit to my counterpart in Myanmar during his presidency, after coming out of that trip, I suggested to him, why don't we give scholarships to Myanmar nationals, because we saw a dire need for training, even in operating heavy equipment.
Wow.
Kasi what actually led to that was a very simple observation. We saw construction equipment. The embassy people in Myanmar told us, alam niyo, mga Pilipino nagmamaneho ng mga crane na yan, ng mga bulldozer na yan. Wala sa kanilang marunong. So when we came back to the President, why don't we use some of your President's social funds and let us have a scholarship program to train even equipment operators up to master's degree programs in economic development. So we had 60 Myanmar scholars come here.
Wow.
And that's something that he continues to be proud about as well. Of course, I'm proud of the fact that I was the one who brought to him the idea. And as I said, that was a brief time when we were a donor country to a fellow ASEAN member. So mga ganyan pinag-uusapan namin, yung mga nice experiences about. So it's more of nostalgia discussions.
Maybe the last two questions. Baka nasagot mo na rin eh. What do you tell people of your stint with FVR? And what do you see as his greatest legacy?
Well, again, nasagot ko nga to a large extent yung first question, and I write about it a lot. Sometimes, some people think maybe a bit too often na, well, especially those who are very fiercely defensive of the current leadership. But I couldn't help looking back to his leadership because of those three qualities. Again, unifying, teamwork, and of course his standards of excellence in what we do. He brought out the best in all of us, and he led by example. I constantly go back to those three attributes of his excellent leadership as I assess the successive leaders that came after him. Kaya wala talagang in my view, he's still the standard of good leadership for the country.
Thank you very much.